At 07:42 on the morning of March 6, 1944, Colonel Donald Blakeslee sat in the cockpit of a P-51 B Mustang at Debden airfield in England, preparing to lead a mission that Luftwaffe intelligence had calculated to be aerodynamically impossible. The target was Berlin, 560 miles into the fortified heart of Nazi Germany, and German High Command had staked their entire defensive strategy on a single assumption. No American single-engine fighter possessed the fuel capacity to reach the capital and return home. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German miscalculation was not born from ignorance or laziness. Luftwaffe technical intelligence officers had examined every American fighter that fell into their hands. They had measured fuel tank capacities, calculated consumption rates at various altitudes and power settings, factored in combat maneuvering allowances, and built mathematical models that all pointed to the same conclusion. The round trip to Berlin was 1,100 miles. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its rugged construction and devastating firepower, could escort bombers only 230 miles from English bases with internal fuel, extendable to roughly 375 miles with external drop tanks. That barely reached the German border. The P-38 Lightning offered better range, approximately 450 miles combat radius. But the twin-engine design suffered catastrophic mechanical failures in the freezing temperatures at high altitude over Europe. Turbocharger systems froze, intercoolers iced over. Both engines would quit simultaneously at 30,000 feet, a phenomenon American pilots grimly called getting P-38'd. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Berlin lay beyond the physical reach of American single-engine fighters, protected by distance as much as by flak guns and defending interceptors. This assumption shaped every aspect of Luftwaffe defensive doctrine throughout 1943. German fighter controllers positioned their squadrons just beyond the maximum range of American escorts, waiting with predatory patience. They tracked the P-47s and P-38s on radar, watched them approach, monitored their fuel consumption, and counted down the minutes until the American fighters would be forced to turn back toward England. The moment the escorts disappeared from German radar screens, Luftwaffe controllers vectored their fighters toward the now vulnerable bomber formations. The tactics were brutally effective. American bomber crews called it going naked, flying deep into Germany without fighter protection. German pilots called it happy hunting time. The killing fields began where American escort range ended, and the slaughter was systematic and devastating. The human cost of this range limitation was measured in burning aircraft and shattered crews. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force dispatched 376 heavy bombers to attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, industrial targets deep inside Germany, whose destruction would cripple German war production. The P-47 Thunderbolts escorted them to the German border, then turned back, their fuel gauges reading minimum return levels. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. Over 300 German fighters swarmed the unescorted formations. 60 flying fortresses were shot down that day, 600 men killed or captured, all beyond fighter escort range. The wounded bombers that struggled back to England told stories of coordinated attacks, German fighters queuing up in line astern formations, taking turns to make firing passes through the bomber boxes, cannon shells ripping through aluminum fuselage skin, engines exploding, wings folding, aircraft spinning down trailing smoke and fire. Lieutenant Robert Harmon's B-17 took cannon fire in the No. 3 engine 20 minutes after the escorts departed. The engine caught fire immediately, flames streaming back across the wing. The pilot feathered the propeller and activated the fire suppression system, but the flames continued to burn, melting through the engine mount. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s came in from 6 o'clock, cannon shells walking through the fuselage from tail to nose. The tail gunner died instantly. The waist gunners were hit. The aircraft broke apart at the waist, the tail section tumbling away. The forward fuselage, carrying the pilots and bombardier and navigator, fell in a flat spin. 3 men got out. 7 did not. The bomber formations tightened up, tried to mass their defensive firepower, but 50 caliber machine guns could not stop determined Luftwaffe pilots making head-on attacks at 400 miles per hour closing speed. The German fighters would roll inverted, dive from above, come screaming through the formations, guns blazing, break away below, then climb back up for another pass. The attacks continued for hours, all the way to the target and all the way back until the battered survivors reached the range limit where American fighters could meet them again. By October 1943, the situation had become unsustainable. The second Schweinfurt raid, on October the 14th, cost 60 bombers, shot down in a single mission. Another 17 damaged beyond repair, 100 more, requiring extensive repairs before they could fly again. The total loss rate was 29%. General Henry Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces, ordered a temporary halt to deep penetration missions. The replacement crews were arriving in England with inadequate training and dying on their first or second missions. The bomber groups were being bled white. Something fundamental had to change, or the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse. Without air superiority over Germany, the planned invasion of France would face catastrophic casualties. German factories would continue producing tanks and aircraft and submarines. The war would drag on for years. More American soldiers would die on French beaches if the Luftwaffe was not destroyed first. But destroying the Luftwaffe required attacking targets deep inside Germany, targets the Germans would defend with everything they had, and attacking those targets required long-range fighter escort. The problem was simple to state and seemingly impossible to solve. No American fighter could fly far enough. German intelligence officers believed they understood American aircraft capabilities completely. They had examined captured P-47s in detail, measuring every fuel tank, calculating maximum range under optimal conditions. They had interrogated American pilots shot down over Germany, asking detailed questions about fuel management, cruise speeds, combat allowances. They had built full-scale models of American fighters and tested them in wind tunnels. Every analysis confirmed the same conclusion. The laws of physics dictated that a single-engine fighter could not carry enough fuel to reach Berlin and return while maintaining sufficient performance to engage in combat. The Germans were not simply guessing. They were conducting rigorous engineering analysis, and their conclusions were based on sound aeronautical principles. A fighter aircraft's range depended on fuel capacity and fuel consumption rate. Fuel consumption depended on engine power settings, which determined speed. Combat operations required high power settings for maneuvering, which consumed fuel rapidly. Therefore, any fighter with enough fuel to reach Berlin would lack sufficient reserves for combat, or any fighter with sufficient fuel for combat would lack the range to reach Berlin. The mathematics appeared ironclad. This certainty permeated Luftwaffe defensive planning at every level. Fighter group commanders positioned their units, assuming American escorts would never penetrate beyond Western Germany. Pilots were briefed that they would never see enemy fighters over Berlin. The capital's air defenses relied primarily on anti-aircraft artillery, not fighter interception, because enemy fighters simply could not reach the city. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had been personally assured by his technical staff that Berlin was beyond the range of American single-engine fighters. The city was protected by distance and mathematics. No amount of courage or determination could overcome fuel capacity limitations. The Germans built their entire defensive strategy on this foundation, and the foundation was about to crumble. What the Germans failed to understand was that American engineers had approached the range problem from a completely different direction. Instead of trying to extend the range of existing fighters through minor modifications, North American aviation had designed an entirely new aircraft around the requirement for exceptional range. The P-51 Mustang was not an improved version of earlier fighters. It was a fundamental reimagining of what a single-engine fighter could be. The design process had been unconventional from the beginning. In April 1940, The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, requesting they build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license to help meet Britain's desperate need for fighter aircraft. North American's president, James Kindleberger, made a counter-proposal. His company could design and build a completely new fighter in the same timeframe required to set up P-40 production. The British were skeptical but desperate enough to agree. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmued, led a team that completed the entire design in 117 days. The prototype flew in October 1940. The British named it Mustang. The early Mustangs used Allison engines and were initially disappointing at high altitude. The Allison engine's performance fell off dramatically above 15,000 feet, making the aircraft unsuitable for bomber escort missions where combat occurred at 20 to 30,000 feet. The Royal Air Force relegated the early Mustangs to low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles where the aircraft's excellent handling and exceptional range were valuable, but its altitude limitations did not matter. The Mustang might have remained a footnote in aviation history, a capable low-altitude fighter, but nothing revolutionary. Except for one man's insight. Ronald Harker was a test pilot for Rolls-Royce. In April 1942, he flew a Mustang and immediately recognized that the airframe was extraordinary. The aerodynamics were superb. The handling was excellent. The fuel capacity was unprecedented for a single-engine fighter. The problem was simply the wrong engine. Harker wrote a detailed report suggesting that if the Allison engine was replaced with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, which featured a two-stage supercharger that maintained power output to 30,000 feet and beyond, the aircraft would have outstanding high-altitude performance. Combined with the Mustang's clean aerodynamic design and large fuel capacity, a Merlin-powered Mustang might be the long-range high-altitude fighter everyone needed. The British took the suggestion seriously. They shipped 5 Mustang airframes to Rolls-Royce for experimental conversion. The results exceeded every expectation. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang's top speed increased from 365 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Climb rate improved dramatically. Service ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. The aircraft transformed from a capable low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude interceptor. More importantly, the range remained extraordinary. The Mustang's internal fuel capacity was already larger than any comparable single-engine fighter. The original design included 84 gallons in wing tanks. During production, an additional 85-gallon fuel tank was installed in the fuselage directly behind the pilot, bringing total internal capacity to 169 gallons. This was supplemented by 2 external drop tanks, each holding 108 gallons, giving the P-51 B Mustang a total fuel capacity of 385 gallons. No other single-engine fighter in service with any Air Force carried that much fuel. North American began production of Merlin-powered Mustangs in 1943, designated P-51 B and P-51 C models. The Merlin engine was built under license by Packard in America. Designated V-1657. The combination of the Merlin engine's high-altitude performance and the Mustang's exceptional fuel capacity created an aircraft with capabilities that seemed impossible according to German calculations. With internal fuel only, the P-51 B had a combat radius of 475 miles. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, the radius extended to 850 miles. That was enough. That was finally enough to reach Berlin. The mathematics that German intelligence officers had relied upon were based on conventional fighter designs where fuel capacity was limited by weight and space considerations. The Mustang had been designed from the beginning to maximize range. Every design decision prioritized fuel capacity and aerodynamic efficiency. The result was an aircraft that broke the rules German engineers thought were unbreakable. But there was a problem with all that fuel, a problem that nearly prevented the Mustang from fulfilling its potential. The 85-gallon fuselage tank was located behind the pilot, aft of the aircraft's center of gravity. When fully loaded, the tank shifted the center of gravity so far rearward that the aircraft became dangerously unstable in pitch. Test pilots reported that with a full fuselage tank, the P-51B wanted to tumble. Hard turns or violent pullouts caused the control forces to reverse. The pilot would have to push forward on the stick to prevent the nose from pitching up further. An aircraft in this condition could not dogfight. It could barely maneuver. The solution required careful fuel management. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank fuel first during climb-out and cruise before entering areas where combat was likely. Once the fuselage tank was empty or nearly empty, the center of gravity shifted forward and the aircraft handled normally. This meant pilots had to monitor fuel consumption constantly, switching tanks at precisely the right moments, calculating remaining range to target, estimating time available for combat, ensuring sufficient fuel remained for the return flight. One mistake, and they would run out of fuel over Germany. There would be no rescue, no friendly territory to glide toward. The mathematics were unforgiving. The 354th Fighter Group arrived in England in December 1943, equipped with the new P-51 B Mustangs. They flew their first escort mission on December 5th, escorting bombers to Amiens, France. On December 13th, they escorted bombers to Kiel, Germany, a penetration of 480 miles. The deepest American single-engine fighters had flown into Germany up to that date. The Luftwaffe responded with over 200 fighters. The 354th shot down 8 German aircraft and lost none of their own. The P-51 worked. It could fly deep into Germany, fight, and come home. Major General James Doolittle, who had just taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, immediately understood the implications. With enough Mustangs, he could escort bombers anywhere in Germany. He could force the Luftwaffe to fight at a time and place of American choosing. He could destroy the German fighter force through attrition, but he needed hundreds of Mustangs, and he needed them immediately. Doolittle began converting fighter groups from P-47s to P-51s as quickly as aircraft became available. The 4th Fighter Group, one of the most experienced units in the 8th Air Force, was next. Colonel Donald Blakeslee, who had been temporarily assigned to the 354th to help them transition to combat operations, returned to the 4th in January as the new group commander. He wanted his group equipped with Mustangs immediately. He pushed hard. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, was reluctant. Converting an entire fighter group to a new aircraft type required taking the unit off combat operations for several weeks, while pilots transitioned to the new aircraft and ground crews learned new maintenance procedures. Kepner could not afford to lose an entire fighter group during the critical build-up to the planned invasion of France. Blakeslee made him an offer that seemed impossible. Give me the P-51s, and I will have the 4th Fighter Group operational within 24 hours. Kepner thought it was absurd. Blakeslee's pilots had been flying P-47s for over a year. They had no experience in the P-51. The ground crews had never maintained Merlin engines. 24 hours was not enough time to convert an entire fighter group. Blakeslee insisted his pilots had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to American service. They knew Merlin engines. They understood British systems. His mechanics had worked on Merlins for years. They could handle it. Kepner agreed, but with a condition. If the 4th Fighter Group was not fully operational within 48 hours, Blakeslee would be relieved of command. The 4th Fighter Group received their first P-51 B Mustangs on February 26, 1944. Blakeslee assembled his pilots in the briefing room and delivered the simplest instructions they had ever received. Learn to fly them on the way to the target. They would begin combat operations within 48 hours. Some pilots would have less than 30 minutes of flight time in the P-51 before flying their first combat mission. The mechanics worked through the night, familiarizing themselves with the new aircraft, checking systems, loading ammunition, installing drop tanks. By February 28th, the 4th Fighter Group flew their first P-51 mission, escorting bombers to France. Every aircraft returned safely. Blakeslee had kept his promise. The conversion that should have taken weeks had been completed in 2 days. By early March 1944, the 8th Air Force had sufficient P-51s to attempt what had been impossible 6 months earlier, a daylight bombing raid on Berlin with fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The mission was scheduled for March 3rd, but weather scrubbed it. They tried again on March 4th. The weather was marginal but acceptable. Over 600 bombers took off, escorted by over 650 fighters, including the 4th Fighter Group's P-51s. It was the first large-scale American attack on Berlin. Blakeslee led his 48 Mustangs into the mission briefing at 0500 hours. The map showed the route northeast across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, across northern Germany, straight to Berlin. The bombers would strike industrial targets in the city. The fighters would provide continuous escort from takeoff to landing. No bomber would fly unescorted. The weather forecast predicted scattered clouds over the target with visibility 3 to 5 miles. German fighter opposition was expected to be heavy. Intelligence estimated 300 to 400 German fighters would be airborne. The American fighters would be outnumbered in the target area, but they would have the advantage of altitude and position. Fuel management remained the critical factor that separated success from catastrophe. Pilots were instructed to burn their fuselage tanks to below 40 gallons before crossing into German territory. Drop tanks would be jettisoned when empty or when combat became imminent. Each pilot was responsible for monitoring his own fuel state and calculating his own return fuel requirements. The mathematics were unforgiving. If you ran out of fuel over Berlin, you were not going home. The nearest friendly territory was the Netherlands, over 200 miles from Berlin. A P-51 could glide perhaps 30 miles with no engine power. The calculation was simple and brutal. The 4th Fighter Group took off at 0742, 48 Mustangs, each loaded with 2 108-gallon drop tanks, full ammunition, and enough fuel to reach Berlin and fight. The aircraft were heavy. Takeoff at maximum gross weight required precise technique. Too much throttle and the engine torque would pull the aircraft off the runway centerline. Too little throttle and the aircraft would not accelerate fast enough to become airborne before running out of runway. Blakeslee's Mustang lifted off after using 3/4 of the available runway. He climbed to 1,000 feet, circled once, and watched his 3 squadrons form up behind him. 48 aircraft in tight formation, silver Mustangs against the grey English morning sky. They set course for the North Sea. The flight to Germany took 2.5 hours. The bombers were already ahead, strung out in a formation 70 miles long, over 600 heavy bombers carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward the Nazi capital. The 4th Fighter Group rendezvoused with their assigned bomber group over the Netherlands at 0915, exactly on schedule. Blakeslee positioned his fighters in a combat spread formation 5,000 feet above the bombers, weaving back and forth to maintain position while the bombers flew straight and level. Below, the Dutch countryside passed by, fields and rivers and small towns. Ahead, Germany waited. They crossed the border at 0935. The first contrails appeared immediately, high-altitude German fighters positioning for attack. Blakeslee counted at least 40, perhaps 50. More appeared every minute, climbing from airfields scattered across northern Germany. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything they had. Blakeslee called out the contacts on the radio. Bogies 11 o'clock high, 20 plus. Bogies 1 o'clock level, 20 plus. Bandits forming up ahead, estimate 50 plus. His pilots acknowledged. Everyone saw them. The Germans were massing for a coordinated attack. At 0958, the first German fighters dove toward the bombers. Blakeslee called out, "Here they come. Break left and engage." The 4th Fighter Group turned into the attack. What followed was 7 minutes of violent aerial combat that would be analyzed by military historians for decades. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s tried to break through the escort screen. The P-51s blocked them, turning inside their attacks, firing in deflection, forcing the Germans to break off or die. Blakeslee's guns jammed after 2 seconds of firing, but he continued flying anyway, positioning his aircraft to force German fighters into positions where his wingman could shoot them. Squadron Commander Major James Goodson destroyed 2 Focke-Wulf 190s in quick succession. Captain Don Gentile engaged a Bf-109 from 200 yards range and watched it explode. Aircraft twisted and dove, guns firing, shells hitting, aircraft smoking. The radio chatter was constant, urgent voices calling out threats and confirmations. Break right. Bandit on your 6. Got him. 2 more at 3 o'clock. Watch the one below. Blakeslee kept his squadrons together, maintained position over the bombers, denied the Germans any clear approach. The German fighters tried repeatedly to get past the escorts, tried to reach the bombers, but the Mustangs blocked every attempt. Finally, low on fuel and ammunition, the German fighters broke off and dove away. The 4th Fighter Group had lost none of their own and had shot down 5 confirmed German aircraft. More importantly, every bomber in their assigned group reached the target safely. Over Berlin, the sky filled with flak. Thousands of German anti-aircraft guns firing upward, filling the air with exploding steel fragments. The bombers flew through it, holding formation, opening their bomb bay doors. 10,000 feet below, Berlin spread across the landscape, grey buildings and streets, and the winding Spree River. The bombers released their ordnance. Thousands of bombs falling, trailing smoke, disappearing into the city below. Blakeslee watched from 30,000 feet, watched the explosions blossom across the city center, watched the smoke rise. Berlin was burning. The bombers turned west for the return flight. More German fighters appeared, trying to attack the damaged bombers straggling behind the formations. The P-51s stayed with them, defending, escorting all the way across Germany, across the Netherlands, until they reached the North Sea in safety. The mission took 6 hours and 40 minutes from takeoff to landing. Blakeslee landed at Debden at 1400 hours, with 20 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for 10 minutes of flight. Every aircraft of the 4th Fighter Group returned. Not one bomber they escorted was shot down by German fighters. What none of the Americans realized was that on the ground in Berlin, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was watching from his headquarters. He saw the contrails of American fighters over the city. He had been told it was impossible. His intelligence officers had calculated that no American single-engine fighter had the range to reach Berlin. His engineers had examined captured P-47s and P-38s and concluded that neither aircraft could fly that far. His fighter controllers had assured him that American bomber raids would always be vulnerable beyond escort range. They were all wrong. When Göring saw P-51s flying over Berlin, escorting the bombers, he understood immediately what it meant. The strategic balance had shifted fundamentally and irreversibly. The Americans could now bomb any target in Germany with fighter escort. There was nowhere left to hide. The Luftwaffe would have to fight over their own cities, over their own factories, over their own airfields. They would be fighting at the end of supply lines stretched to breaking, with inadequate fuel, with poorly trained replacement pilots against an enemy with numerical superiority and superior equipment. It was, Göring later admitted during post-war interrogations, the moment he knew Germany would lose the air war. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was immediate and devastating. German fighter pilots had owned the sky over their homeland for 3 years. They had known with absolute certainty that beyond a specific distance from England, American fighter escorts would have to turn back, leaving the bombers vulnerable. That knowledge had given them confidence, had allowed them to plan their attacks, to position their formations at exactly the right point, to maximize their tactical advantages. Now that advantage was gone forever. American fighters could be anywhere, at any altitude, at any distance from England. The Americans returned to Berlin on March 6th. This time, 800 bombers attacked, escorted by over 900 fighters. The 4th Fighter Group flew again. Blakeslee led them back to the capital. The Luftwaffe was ready this time. They had pulled fighters from the Eastern Front, from Italy, from France, from everywhere they could find them. Over 350 German fighters were airborne when the Americans arrived. The battle that followed became known among Luftwaffe pilots as Black Monday. It was one of the largest air battles ever fought over Europe. The 4th Fighter Group encountered German fighters 50 miles from Berlin. The Luftwaffe had changed tactic. Instead of attacking the bombers directly, they focused first on destroying the fighter escorts. If they could eliminate the P-51s, the bombers would be vulnerable. Wave after wave of Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove through the American fighter formations, trying to break them up, scatter them, eliminate the cohesive escort coverage. The American pilots fought back with everything they had. Major James Goodson destroyed 2 German fighters. Lieutenant Howard Hiverly engaged multiple enemy aircraft. Across the entire 8th Fighter Command, American pilots fought with intensity, born of understanding what was at stake. The Luftwaffe lost between 66 and 81 aircraft, according to German loss records, though American wartime claims were higher due to multiple pilots claiming the same victories. The Germans inflicted casualties, too. 69 American bombers were shot down, 53 B-17s and 16 B-24s. 11 American fighters were lost, including 4 from the 4th Fighter Group. The losses were heavy, but the mission succeeded. The bombers reached their targets. Berlin was bombed again. Most importantly, the presence of P-51s over Berlin was now undeniable. The Germans could no longer claim it was a mistake or a fluke. American single-engine fighters had flown to Berlin twice in 3 days. The impossible had become routine. German fighter pilots began to understand the strategic implications fully by March 8th. 2 days after Black Monday, the 4th Fighter Group returned to Berlin, this time targeting the Erkner Ball bearing works in the city's southwest suburbs. Captain Don Gentile and his wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, pioneered aggressive new tactics on this mission. Gentile shot down 3 Bf-109s in a single engagement, bringing his total to approximately 14 confirmed victories. Together with Godfrey, they claimed 6 enemy aircraft that day, demonstrating that P-51s could not only escort bombers to Berlin, but could dominate German fighters in combat over the Nazi capital. Gentile would eventually be credited with 19.83 aerial victories, plus 6 aircraft destroyed on the ground, making him one of the war's leading aces. His success was not individual achievement, but rather representative of a systematic shift in aerial combat dynamics. Luftwaffe Major Günther Roll, credited with 275 victories on the Eastern Front, flew his first mission defending Berlin during this period. He encountered P-51s at 28,000 feet directly over the city. Roll was an experienced pilot, a recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's most skilled fighter commanders. He understood aircraft performance, fuel consumption calculations, and the mathematical limitations that governed aerial warfare. When he saw P-51s over Berlin, hundreds of miles from England, still flying aggressively with obvious fuel reserves remaining, he immediately understood that something fundamental had changed. After landing, he told his squadron with characteristic German directness that the Americans had solved the range problem definitively. They could escort their bombers anywhere now. The Luftwaffe could not hide anymore. They would have to fight over every target in Germany, and the mathematics of attrition would inevitably destroy them. Other German pilots reported similar realizations, with varying degrees of despair. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, another experienced ace with over 100 victories, flew against P-51s near Berlin on March 9th. He tried the standard Luftwaffe tactic of diving through the fighter screen at high speed, ignoring the escorts trying to reach the bombers before the American fighters could react. The P-51s followed him down, caught him at 15,000 feet and forced him into a turning fight. Steinhoff was flying a Focke-Wulf 190, an excellent aircraft at low altitude with superior roll rate and good acceleration. But the P-51 turned with him, stayed on his tail through multiple reversals and fired repeatedly. Steinhoff escaped only by diving to treetop level and running at maximum speed. He landed with bullet holes in his rudder and elevator. He told his ground crew with uncharacteristic emotion that the Mustang had followed him all the way down and stayed with him through every maneuver. He could not outturn it. He could not outdive it. And most critically, it could fly farther than any German fighter. He did not know how the Luftwaffe was supposed to defeat an aircraft that was faster, more maneuverable, longer-ranged, and present in unlimited numbers. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots extended beyond simple tactical disadvantage. For 3 years, German fighter pilots had operated with the psychological security of knowing that American bombers would eventually be alone and vulnerable. That certainty had provided a foundation for tactical planning and personal courage. Now, that foundation had been destroyed. American fighters could appear anywhere at any time. German pilots could no longer predict where escorts would turn back because they were not turning back anymore. The rules that had governed aerial combat over Germany had been rewritten entirely, and the new rules favored the Americans overwhelmingly. German fighter commanders tried desperately to adapt. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, ordered his pilots to focus exclusively on the bombers and ignore the fighters whenever tactically possible. The mission was to stop the bombs from reaching their targets, not to achieve favorable kill ratios against enemy fighters. But that strategy proved nearly impossible to execute in practice. The P-51s positioned themselves between German fighters and the bombers with tactical precision. Any attack on the bombers required fighting through the escorts first, and fighting P-51s meant accepting casualties. German intelligence officers worked frantically to determine how the Americans had achieved the range increase. They examined wreckage from shot-down P-51s, looking for modified fuel systems, enlarged tanks, secret technologies that might explain the impossible range. They found the drop tanks, the 108-gallon paper tanks manufactured by Malcolm Hood, Limited in Britain, and they found the large internal fuselage tank behind the pilot. German engineers calculated the additional range provided by these systems and realized the uncomfortable truth. The P-51 had been designed from the beginning with exceptionally large internal fuel capacity. The drop tanks merely extended an already impressive range. There was no secret modification, no revolutionary breakthrough technology. The Americans had simply built a fighter with enough fuel capacity to escort bombers anywhere in Europe. The Germans had never considered it possible because their own design philosophy prioritized performance over range. German fighters were designed for short-range interception missions, scrambling from nearby airfields to defend specific targets. They had assumed American fighters would follow the same design philosophy. The assumption was wrong, and the consequences were catastrophic. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 400 fighter pilots, killed or seriously wounded. Most were lost in battles over Germany, fighting against escorted bomber raids. The casualties were unsustainable. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 200 hours total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, much less engage in aerial combat against experienced American pilots with hundreds of combat hours. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than training programs could replace them. Fuel shortages were becoming critical as American bombers systematically destroyed synthetic fuel plants across Germany. Aircraft production remained high through Albert Speer's rationalization programs, but there were not enough trained pilots to fly them and not enough fuel to keep them operational. Galland reported to Goering that the fighter force was being destroyed through attrition and that without significant increases in pilot training time, fuel allocations, and replacement aircraft, the Luftwaffe would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within months. Goering had no solutions to offer. Hitler demanded that the Luftwaffe stop the bombing raids, but provided no additional resources. The industrial capacity to support those demands simply did not exist anymore. The factories were being bombed. The fuel plants were being destroyed. The transportation system was breaking down. And over all of it, P-51s circled with impunity, shooting down any German fighter that attempted to interfere. The strategic impact crystallized by April 1944. The 8th Air Force had achieved air superiority over most of Germany. Bomber losses dropped from 8% per mission in October 1943 to less than 2% in April 1944. The P-51 was primarily responsible for this transformation. With continuous fighter escort from England to any target in Germany and back, bombers could attack in daylight with acceptable losses. The Luftwaffe could still inflict casualties, but they could not stop the raids. Germany's war production was being systematically destroyed, factory by factory, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to prevent it. In April 1944, 8th Fighter Command expanded operations to include aggressive fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations. P-51s would take off early, fly directly to German airfields, and strafe aircraft on the ground before they could take off to intercept the bombers. The tactic was devastating beyond initial expectations. German fighters were destroyed on the ground by dozens. Airfields were cratered, rendering them temporarily unusable. Fuel dumps burned, destroying irreplaceable aviation gasoline. Maintenance facilities were destroyed, eliminating the capacity to repair damaged aircraft. The 4th Fighter Group participated extensively in these ground attack operations throughout April and May 1944. They strafed airfields across Germany, destroying aircraft on the ground and in the air with equal efficiency. The aggressive tactics produced results. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more aircraft on the ground than in aerial combat. The cost was not insignificant. Low-level strafing was extraordinarily dangerous. German airfields were heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across approach paths. P-51s were hit regularly during strafing runs. Some were shot down. Pilots were killed or captured. But the exchange ratio favored the Americans overwhelmingly. For every P-51 lost to ground fire, the Germans lost 10 or more aircraft destroyed on the ground, plus trained pilots who might have been killed when their aircraft exploded during the strafing attack, plus mechanics and ground crew killed in the attacks, plus the infrastructure damage that prevented operations from continuing, even if aircraft survived. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force existed only as a shadow of what it had been 1 year earlier. On D-Day, June 6th, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed only 100 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies flew over 14,000. German pilots who attempted to attack the invasion fleet were shot down almost immediately by overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe completely. The P-51 had made that possible. Without the long-range escort capability, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed due to unsustainable losses. Without the strategic bombing campaign succeeding, air superiority over France could not have been achieved. Without air superiority, the D-Day invasion would have faced catastrophically higher casualties and might have failed entirely. The P-51's range made air superiority achievable, and air superiority made victory inevitable. After the war, Hermann Goering was interrogated extensively by American intelligence officers. They asked him systematically what factors had led to Germany's defeat in the air war. Goering's answer was documented in official United States Army Air Forces interrogation records with notable precision. Long-range fighters were the most decisive factor in the air war. He stated clearly that deep bomber penetrations were only possible with long-range escort capability, and that this capability came as a complete surprise to the Luftwaffe High Command. When American fighters appeared over Berlin for the first time, Goering admitted he knew immediately that the eventual results would be tragic for Germany. The strategic air offensive could continue indefinitely, and the Luftwaffe lacked the industrial resources, trained personnel, and fuel reserves to stop it. The outcome became mathematically certain the moment P-51s appeared over Berlin. Everything that followed was merely the working out of that initial catastrophic failure in German intelligence assessment. The mechanics who maintained the P-51s have rarely received appropriate historical recognition. Their names do not appear prominently in history books or documentary films, but they worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days each week, keeping the aircraft operationally ready. They changed engines in freezing rain. They repaired battle damage in unheated hangars. They loaded ammunition before dawn so missions could take off on schedule. Each aircraft required constant maintenance. The Merlin engine needed oil changes every 25 flying hours. Spark plugs fouled regularly and required replacement. The coolant system developed leaks that had to be sealed immediately. The ammunition belts for the 650 caliber machine guns had to be loaded by hand, 1,800 rounds per aircraft, every single round inspected individually and loaded into the belts that fed the wing guns. Drop tanks had to be installed with fuel lines properly connected, electrical systems tested, every control surface checked for proper movement and structural integrity, every tire inspected for wear patterns that might indicate alignment problems, every hydraulic line examined for leaks. The work never stopped. A typical maintenance shift began at 0400 hours. The mechanics arrived in darkness, used flashlights to conduct pre-flight inspections, started engines to check for oil leaks and unusual sounds, tested magnetos and generators, verified fuel quantities, and armed the guns. By 0600, every aircraft had to be mission-ready. If a pilot reported any problem during engine start, the mechanics had minutes to diagnose and repair it, or the mission would be delayed. Delays meant bombers flew without escorts. Bombers without escorts meant crews died. The mechanics understood the stakes completely. They worked with desperate speed and absolute accuracy, double-checking everything because mistakes killed people. Colonel Blakeslee flew combat missions until October 1944, when he was grounded by direct order from 8th Fighter Command Headquarters. He had accumulated over 1,000 combat hours, more than any American pilot in the European theater, and headquarters determined they could not risk losing him. Blakeslee was devastated by the order. He wanted to continue flying, to continue fighting, to remain with his pilots until the war ended. But the order was final and non-negotiable. He returned to the United States in November 1944. The 4th Fighter Group continued fighting without him, adding to their total victories until they became the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater, with over 1,000 confirmed aerial victories. Blakeslee remained in the Air Force after the war, commanded a fighter wing during Korea, and retired as a colonel in 1965. He received the Distinguished Service Cross twice, the Silver Star twice, the Distinguished Flying Cross 7 times, and numerous other decorations from multiple nations. He never sought publicity for his accomplishments. When asked about the Berlin missions years later, during a rare interview, he stated simply that they did what needed to be done. Nothing more required saying. Wars are ultimately won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances, with insufficient resources and inadequate preparation. The P-51 succeeded because thousands of individuals made it work through competence and determination. Pilots who flew 6-hour missions, knowing one navigation error meant death over enemy territory. Mechanics who worked through exhaustion, keeping aircraft operationally ready under field conditions. Engineers who designed systems that functioned reliably under combat stress loads never anticipated during peacetime testing. Intelligence officers who planned routes maximizing range while minimizing exposure to known flak concentrations and fighter bases. Factory workers who built 15,000 Mustangs in 3 years while maintaining quality control standards. Test pilots who identified handling problems and developed solutions. Flight instructors who trained replacement pilots despite chronic shortages of aircraft and fuel. Everyone contributed to a system that collectively changed the outcome of the war in ways that became apparent only through historical analysis decades later. On March 6, 1944, Colonel Blakeslee did not know he was participating in a mission that military historians would analyze for generations. He was executing his assigned duties, protecting bombers, attempting to keep his pilots alive through another mission. The fact that he was accomplishing what German intelligence had calculated to be aerodynamically impossible did not matter in the immediate moment. He saw enemy fighters, engaged them according to tactical doctrine, defended the bombers, and returned home. The historical significance became clear only later, when analysts examined the operational data and realized what had actually occurred. The Americans had solved the range problem that had seemed unsolvable. The escorts could reach any target in Germany. The Luftwaffe had nowhere left to hide. The strategic bombing campaign could continue until Germany's industrial capacity was completely destroyed. air superiority was mathematically assured, the invasion could proceed with acceptable risk levels. Victory became not just possible, but inevitable. For the German pilots who saw those silver Mustangs over Berlin, that morning, circling at 30,000 feet with obvious fuel reserves remaining, the implications were immediate and crushing. They understood instantly that the air war had shifted fundamentally. American fighters were flying deeper into Germany than mathematical models said was possible. The escorts were not turning back anymore. Every target was now vulnerable to coordinated daylight attack with fighter protection. The Luftwaffe would have to defend everywhere simultaneously, spreading diminishing forces across an impossibly wide defensive front. They would be fighting at the end of extended supply lines with inadequate fuel reserves, with poorly trained replacement pilots, against an enemy with numerical superiority, technological advantages, and essentially unlimited industrial resources. The mathematics of attrition warfare were brutally clear. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, and there was no tactical or strategic solution available that could change the outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.